Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Thanks so much for tuning in. I want to say a special thanks to our producers, Jason Stark and Taylor Terzek. They put in so much work behind the scenes, and we appreciate them. And also to Alan Files, who puts in a lot of work behind the scenes, especially when things go wrong with the website, but also maintenance of the website as well as James Steinbach, who helps out there as well. So thanks to both of them. If you get the chance to share the word about OnScript, please do so on whatever platform you can do that. That really helps us. Otherwise, enjoy the episode. And if you'd like to donate to OnScript, you can do so at onscript.study/donate. Thanks for listening.
Well, welcome to another OnScript. And today I am delighted to welcome to OnScript a good friend of mine. Cor Bennema teaches New Testament at London School of Theology. So he's local to me and also heads up the research department there. Prior to coming to London School of Theology, he taught in a seminary in India for 11 years. And Cor's main research interests are the Johannine writings, the canonical Gospels, character in biblical narrative, and early Christian ethics. And I think one of the things that strikes me as most unique about Cor is he writes for the academy, for sure, but also for the church. And you'll see that blend if you look at his writings on his academia.edu page, which I encourage everybody to check out. We are here today to discuss his latest book, Imitation in Early Christianity, which comes with the subtitle, Mimesis and Religious-Ethical Formation, which came out earlier this year by Eerdmans. And this study is the culmination of years of research and writing and offers the first comprehensive study on mimesis as a religious ethical concept in early Christianity within the intellectual milieu of Jewish and Greco-Roman antiquity. It is an honor to sit down today and talk with you, Cor, and talk about your landmark publication. Cor, welcome to OnScript.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the invitation, and it's an absolute privilege to be here. And I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, likewise. So, let's begin with what drew you into imitation as a theme. You know, was there a particular exegetical problem, or a pedagogical moment, or a scholarly gap that convinced you that this subject needed a comprehensive conceptual treatment across the early Christian corpus?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question. We have to go back to the start of 2012 when I started an extended research leave at Mainz University in Germany, where Ruben Zimmermann kindly hosted me. My initial project was to explore the relationship between identity and behavior in the Johannine writings. And in preparation for this project, I noted in John's Gospel a kind of a formula that gets repeated several times and goes something like this. Just as Jesus did, his disciples should also do. And I found this idea of imitating Jesus intriguing and decided to deal with this first at the start of my project to see how this relates to identity and behavior. And this so-called side issue of imitation then became the main thing, and it started to dominate my research for the next 12 years. Now, in terms of a scholarly gap, I identified 4 issues that needed resolving. First, there is no agreement on the origins of the Christian concept of imitation. Should we look at the Old Testament as the authoritative source document for early Christians? Or has the idea of imitation come from Greek culture as it started to influence various spheres of Jewish culture? Second, what language did early Christian writers use to convey the concept of imitation? Paul, for example, uses the literal term to imitate, but John seems to have developed his own imitation language along the lines I just mentioned, just as Jesus did, so we should also do. And third, while some scholars address imitation in early Christianity, very few seek to show how it works and what its place is in early Christian ethics. And then the final issue we have is how early Christians could imitate an absent Jesus or Paul. Jesus had returned to heaven, so how could early Christians observe and imitate him? And likewise, when Paul instructs Christians to imitate him, he is not present with the church he is writing to. So are there other modes of imitation than physically observing someone? So in this book, I seek to address these issues.
Yeah, indeed you do, and all of these questions you summarily answer, I think, as you go through. This is the first comprehensive study on this subject. What do you think we gain by recovering this more fulsome, multi-perspective, multi-dimensional view?
Well, let me mention three benefits of my integrated multidimensional approach, as you call it, to imitation. First, I explain that imitation is a creative, complex hermeneutical process where someone intentionally observes an exemplary person, discerns what is worthy of imitation, and then determines the form of the imitative act in order to become a better person over time. So authentic imitation has therefore nothing to do with simplistic replication, aping, or a mindless cloning. Second, the second benefit is we are social beings. We are wired to imitate others. So I believe that imitation ethics is an effective and attractive way for moral progress or character formation. Instead of seeking to fulfill a whole list of do's and don'ts, a relational approach where we learn from others who model the Christian life well may appeal to many people, I think. And then the third benefit is more contemporary. We live in a time where many people find their role models on social media and where influencers cultivate an often uncritical following. People are not always aware or careful whom they choose as role models and what they imitate about them. But in antiquity, people were much more intentional about imitation as a moral concept and on how to choose good role models. They also placed the concept of imitation in the broader context of civic life. So I believe we can learn a great deal from them.
Yeah, wonderfully put. Now, part one of book is Mimesis and Antiquity. And you just said that one of the questions you wanted to address is, where does all of this come from? So before getting to early Christianity, you look at both Greco-Roman and Jewish traditions. What did you find as the major differences between them? Do you think you could walk us through your results?
Sure. It's obviously quite comprehensive to look at two big traditions, and there are actually two reasons why I thought that we needed to do that. First, the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible was the authoritative source document for early Christians. So that would be an obvious place to look. But I will explain in a moment, the results are actually not so encouraging. If we were to look only at the Jewish writings, we might think that imitation is an exclusive Judeo-Christian invention. But this is not the case at all. The concept of imitation is actually quite prevalent in many Greco-Roman writings. And that takes me to the second reason. Not only is the concept of imitation widespread in Greco-Roman writings, the ancient Greeks and Romans also describe and discuss the workings of imitation, whereas early Christian authors simply mention the concept. As far as we can know, the discourse on imitation originated in Greek antiquity, starting with Plato and Aristotle, and then it carried on via the rhetorical traditions into the Roman era. Originally, imitation refers to the creative representation of nature through the fine arts, such as dance, painting, sculpture, and poetry. But in due course, it spread to the realms of religion, family, and education to express the imitation of God, parent, and teacher. Now, most scholars agree that due to the extended contact with the Greco-Roman traditions, Judaism, and early Christianity, adopted the idea of imitation into these overlapping spheres of religion, education, and family. And as a result, imitation in early Christianity became almost exclusively an ethical concept, conveying the idea of imitating an exemplary person to become virtuous. So Greco-Roman antiquity is very much the appropriate methodological starting point for my study. So what are my findings then? Well, based on an extensive survey of Greco-Roman writings, I constructed a shared model of how imitation worked in antiquity. And that model has 5 stages or aspects. Let me briefly mention them. So the first aspect is selection and association. So aspiring students, they choose or they are presented with an exemplary person for imitation, and they associate themselves with that person. And then secondly, observation. Imitation is by nature a sensory process where one must closely observe exemplary people in order to imitate them. And then third, discernment. In studying the exemplar, the imitator must discern what is worthy of imitation. And then fourth, we have the imitation in a narrow sense, as it were. Having observed and understood the model, the imitator articulates this in a concrete imitative act that shows correspondence with the original example. And then lastly, transformation. Insofar as imitation relates to ethics, the aim is moral development, where one imitates the exemplar in order to become a better person. But when we turn to Jewish antiquity, the results are not so great. In the Old Testament, there are traces of imitation, but the idea is certainly not developed. We can think of texts such as Genesis 1:26, where humankind is created in the image of God. But this seems to refer more to representation. Or Leviticus 19:2, where God commands the Israelites to be holy because he is holy. But here the connection is causal, because, rather than comparative, which is normally the case with imitation. Or Deuteronomy 10, saying that God looks after the outsider and that the Israelites should also love the outsider because they were once outsiders in Egypt. But again, this may simply denote analogy. Now, looking further in the Old Testament, more generally, Israel is often urged to walk in the way of the Lord and to follow after God. But this seems to refer more to obedience and allegiance than imitation. But when Greek culture started to influence Jewish thought, a process called Hellenization, we see these seeds come to fruition in several Jewish writings of the Second Temple period. So I concluded, perhaps a bit controversial, I don't know, I concluded that the Old Testament cannot adequately explain the concept of imitation in early Christianity. In the Old Testament, we can only see the seeds of imitation which come to fruition when Second Temple Judaism comes into contact with Greek culture. And by the 1st century, the Greco-Roman concept of imitation had also found its way into early Christianity. How's that for an answer?
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I don't know why that should be controversial. I mean, when I'm teaching about Paul and we come to lists of virtues and vices, you don't find that in the Old Testament. But anyway,
yep.
One of the things that you rightly point out is mimesis. The words, the technical terms, aren't there in all texts. Your study shows Paul and John, but there's a lot of other places where it's absent. So, but you're looking for a concept of imitation in ancient texts. So I suppose the question is, how will you know what to look for? How can you know a text indicates imitation or not? What criteria do you use?
Yeah, this is a great and a crucial question, and this is indeed key to my research. So I have to elaborate a little on this. Imitation is central to human life, which means the danger is almost we can start to see it everywhere without having guidelines to what constitutes imitation. Then I also know that in scholarship that some scholars, they use the term imitation very loosely or do not define it at all, while others seem to see imitation in the text without showing why this is the case. So I developed a more precise approach to what imitation is and how it differs from related concepts such as analogy and reciprocity. So first we need to consider what we are looking for. The literal terms for imitation, they occur mainly in Paul and in the Apostolic Fathers, so that's quite easy. But John, as we will find out, developed his own imitation language. And the Synoptics and the Old Testament, as I already indicated, they have no explicit imitation language. Now, many scholars agree that the concept of imitation is broader than the literal term. So they also looked at comparative language and the idea of personal example. But we need some caution here. Now, it is common to work with concepts or ideas at a more abstract level to make sense of the text. We all do that. But we must ensure that such conceptualization is grounded in the text. In other words, our understanding of the early Christian concept of imitation must be rooted in real words of early Christian literature. So my book seeks to outline the imitation language of the various early Christian authors to determine the semantic domain of imitation. But I also explained how the concept of imitation differs from related concepts such as analogy, correspondence, reciprocity, etc. Now, let me give you a few examples on how imitation differs from analogy, its closest equivalent. When John writes in his first letter, we must live just as Jesus lived, that is comparative language. The literal term imitation is not used. It's comparative language, but where most people agree that indicates imitation. But when Jesus, for instance, in Mark 4, states that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, this is simply an analogy. Comparative language is used, like, but it's not imitation. It's simply an analogy that compares a particular aspect of God's kingdom with that of a mustard seed. Or when Jesus likens the work of the Spirit to the blowing of the wind in John 3, obviously the Spirit does not imitate the wind. There's no intentionality, etc. Rather, the work of the Spirit is explained by means of a comparison to the workings of the wind. In other words, imitation is a subset or a narrower form of analogy, and not all comparative language indicates imitation. Of course, detecting imitation in a text is no hard science, and there remains a subjective aspect involved. So I also use a sliding scale as a heuristic device to assess the likelihood of imitation in a particular passage. So I create a kind of an imitation continuum with the indicators weak, medium, and strong to express my certainty of the presence of imitation in a particular text. And the results of analyzing this imitation language across the early Christian writings are quite interesting. Perhaps as an oversimplification, Paul and the Apostolic Fathers, as I mentioned, they often use the standard imitation language of the Greco-Roman traditions. But John uniquely developed his own imitation language, often along the lines of that formula, just as Jesus did, his disciples should also do. Other parts of the New Testament use imitation language less prominently, but there are still sporadic occurrences. But it shows that imitation was clearly part of early Christian ethics, although not homogeneous or equally prevalent everywhere. It's a bit of a long answer, but this is absolutely key.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating and very, very helpful as a methodological set of proposals as well to handle these ancient texts in this regard. And I wanted to turn now actually to part 2, where you're looking at mimesis in the New Testament. I found it particularly interesting. This is something your study could do because it was so exhaustive and it's the first of its kind. You could compare and contrast the ways in which language is or is not taken up in the different authors. I found that very interesting. Anyway, to the Synoptic Gospels, because I think there's quite a lot of controversy here, perhaps, which will be fun to get into. So you're very clear, and it's directly obvious the term imitation is absent in the Synoptics. Now, you're going to argue, okay, it could still be present, but it's less present than elsewhere. So I suppose there's a number of questions that come off the back here. Okay, why is it less present? What forms does it take if it is to be seen as present at all? And if you have time, I would love to hear a little bit more about what for some might be a controversial claim, that the language of following Jesus isn't about imitation. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that.
Yep. So I indeed noted that the literal term is not present in the Synoptics, but neither is it obviously in John, to which we will come. So that is not necessarily an excuse, because as I mentioned or already hinted at, John developed his own mimetic language. The Synoptics apparently don't seem to do that. Why not? I can't really answer. But the issue of following is indeed very, very interesting. And it was actually in the 1960s where a number of scholars looked at imitation across the New Testament. Probably this was still before the era of super specialization, so it was still acceptable to do that. So there were a number of significant scholars, like the Dutch-American scholar De Boer, Tinsley, Anselm Schultz, and Hans-Dieter Betz. They looked at the concept of following Jesus and imitating Christ in Paul. And they said more or less, well, following Jesus in the Synoptics is the equivalent of imitating Christ in the Gospels. And there was a big debate. And some modern scholars, they seem to assume also quite readily that following Jesus means imitating him. So here, perhaps I'm a little bit controversial. It seems logical. After all, should the disciples, besides taking in Jesus' teaching, not also learn by observing and imitating him? However, and I keep hammering on that imitation language, there is no linguistic expression that links following Jesus to imitating him. There is no, let's say, in the surroundings of following Jesus, I can't see any linguistic expression that might indicate imitation that I can tie into following Jesus. Besides, to follow obviously has also other connotations of allegiance and obedience. So basically, and I followed De Boer a little bit from his doctoral work in 1962, rather than claiming that to follow means to imitate, I think it's more accurate to say that following Jesus can facilitate the imitation of Jesus. It is when people follow Jesus that they can observe and imitate him. Now, there are very few clear instances of imitation in the Synoptics. And interestingly, there are two clear instances of imitating God, which is already unusual in itself, because imitating Jesus seems to be the norm in early Christianity. And the Synoptic authors, unfortunately, do not explain this further. But let me mention those two instances, because something very interesting is happening there. So we find them in Matthew 5:48. So this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect." So here we have the just as, that comparative language. And the equivalent in Luke 6:36, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." Now, scholars, when they looked at it, and some see that imitative aspect there, they also recognize that these two imperatives are rooted in Leviticus 19:2. So that's not controversial. But in Leviticus 19:2, and I have already mentioned it, God commands the Israelites to be holy because he is holy. So the Levitical holiness command uses a causal connection. Be holy because God is holy. So I argue that is not really imitation. It is more like we are given the grounds, the reason why Israel, and by extension, Christians need to be holy. But Matthew and Luke, they use a comparative conjunction, just as. So they do not only tap into Leviticus 19:2, but they turn it explicitly into a command for imitation. So that's a very interesting one, but unfortunately they don't really explain it too much. Now, when we look across the Synoptics, we can find a handful of possible instances of imitation, but I evaluated them mostly as weak to medium. And I also mentioned, even if you have 20 cases across the synoptics of weak to medium, cumulatively, that doesn't make it a strong case. So based on the patchy evidence of imitation in the synoptics, and I must add the book of Acts, I put that together, we cannot really construct a model of imitation, and we cannot really gain insight into how imitation worked in early Christianity. I don't have really an explanation why not, but it just forced me to look further into early Christian writings to see where we can find better results.
Fascinating. And as you know, especially with Mark, right? Then you turn to John and the Johannine writings, and it's quite a different picture. And there's a very distinctive take that, as you point out, on imitation. And honestly, I can think of few people better placed to discuss this than you. You've published in a couple of different editions, Encountering Jesus Character Studies in the Gospel of John. You've published the book with LNTS, Mimesis in the Johannine Literature. So this is really your field. And maybe you can just unpack for us now, how does John tackle imitation? What's distinct?
Absolutely. Well, let me take John 13 as a bit of a case study, because we find two distinct instances of imitation. There, one related to the foot washing and the other one to the love command, and most people are familiar with it. So John 13 is an ideal starting point, and this is part of the farewell discourses, almost where Jesus takes his disciples in private, etc. So maybe that is where this comes to the fore. But John 13 is an ideal starting point to understand how imitation works, because not only do we have here the first and clearest example of Jesus instructing his disciples to imitate him, this episode also shows how imitation works, which is quite unusual because, as I mentioned, in most early Christian writings, it's merely mentioned rather than explained. And when we understand the workings of imitation in the foot washing, we see that it actually closely corresponds to the model of imitation we found in the Greco-Roman traditions. So here we go. In John 13, verses 4 and 5 and verses 12, they bookend the event of the foot washing. 3 consecutive verbs describes vividly Jesus' actions at the start. He stands up from the table, he removes his garment, and he washes his disciples' feet. And then in reverse order at the end, it says, having washed his disciples' feet, he puts on his garment and reclines again at the table. Usually, as we said, one can only imitate what one observes. And indeed, instead of telling the disciples that they should wash one another's feet, Jesus shows, he demonstrates what needs imitation. And only then does Jesus issue the command to imitate him in verse 15. For I gave you an example that just as, here we have the comparative language again, that just as I did to you, you also should do. And the example that he refers to, of course, is the foot washing, the visible model for imitation. So far, so good. But we must now consider whether this instruction calls for a literal replication of the foot washing or whether it's a broad call to humble, loving service. And an important clue is to note that authentic imitation requires understanding. As I mentioned in the beginning, authentic imitation in antiquity had nothing to do with simplistic replication or mindless cloning. When Jesus goes back to the table after the foot washing, he does not immediately tell the disciples to imitate his example. Instead, he first asks them, do you understand what I have done to you? Do you understand what I have done to you? Jesus checks whether the disciples have understood what he had demonstrated for them. So they must interpret Jesus' example in order to imitate him. True imitation cannot be a mindless cloning or a simplistic replication. It is a cognitive process where the believer has to interpret Jesus' example in order to imitate it. And I call this moral reasoning. That is thinking in line with God's character, values, and norms as they are exemplified by Jesus. And this means that the imitator must understand the intent of the original act and then articulate this understanding in a corresponding imitative act. Of course, this does not rule out the literal practice of foot washing as an expression of humble, loving service, but it certainly does not exhaust the scope of what Jesus meant. And this foot washing episode contains all the elements of the Greco-Roman imitation model. The first aspect is not explicitly mentioned, that aspect of selection and association, but it is obviously there because Jesus' disciples have obviously chosen to be associated with Jesus. But the other aspects, observation, discernment, the imitative act and transformation, they're all mentioned in John 13. So that makes it already quite unique. But John 13 is also crucial for understanding imitation because it mentions the famous love command. Now, if Jesus had simply said to his disciples, I give you a new command, love one another, that would be absolutely clear. No one would probably have too many questions. But interestingly, Jesus adds to this, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. Again, that repetitive formula there. So the significance of this is that the love command is not given in a vacuum, but it proceeds from a precedent. In other words, the disciples' love for one another is based on their personal experience of Jesus' love for them, as they have just experienced in the foot washing. And then I started to note this pattern in the Johannine writings, where Jesus regularly sets the example that the disciples can then imitate. So John, uniquely different to Paul and the Apostolic Fathers, he doesn't use that literal term. Well, he only uses it once in 3 John. But otherwise, he develops his own imitation language through that just as you also construction. Very interesting.
Yeah, indeed. Very interesting. Now, before we get to Paul and other New Testament writings, the quick fire round. Now, this is where you have not been told what I'm about to ask in any shape or form. So any sort of knee-jerk, immediate responses is what we're after. And I do like to trip people up as well, on the way.
Okay.
So here's the first one for you. I don't think this was in the book either, the claim, imitation being the sincerest form of flattery, So if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and you've graded a number of essays, I do not doubt, why is plagiarism wrong?
Well, yeah, to some extent, I actually joke about it in my classes. But again, imitation has been around as long as humans have been around. And in antiquity, people were not stupid. And there were, let's say, forms of imitation that were not condoned, or imitation which were forms of imitation which were used with the wrong intention or the wrong aims. So flattery would be one of them. Plagiarism would be one of them. Counterfeit products today, one of them. So that is where I sometimes talk about authentic imitation or imitation as it was intended. Even in the ancients, they warned. They said some people, they tend to imitate people's faults, etc. So yeah, you need a lot of nuance.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my second question then. What's one habit you've picked up by imitating somebody else, whether it be good or bad?
Well, let me put it slightly differently. Through my research, I try to be much more intentional. As I said, we all imitate, but I have become much more conscious and reflective on the way I imitate others. And sometimes I think, I picked this up from someone. Why did I do that, etc. So that whole thing of using imitation in a better way, being more intentional and reflective about it, that's some of the things that I've learned and picked up on. And I think this is simply not happening enough in today's world. It's very interestingly, if I may, Susan Eastman, in one of her latest books, she taps into that, let's say, unconscious imitation that happens in infants and whatever, and then she transposes that to Paul, which I think doesn't work because Paul's much more intentional. So it's more like, I hope that people start to become more conscious about whom and what they imitate.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah. And certainly that'll be my takeaway, I think, existentially, from encountering your scholarship. If on that, just keeping with the turn to our own lives, is there a particular practice or ritual that you'd like to see make a comeback in the modern church?
Well, the whole concept of mentorship. I think that in certain traditions it is obviously still there, but I think in mainstream Christianity that mentoring and that intentional choosing of role models and intentionally seeking to mentor someone, I would love to see that coming back.
Yeah. How does this factor in, do you think, to the future of theological education, these insights?
Well, I hope that it will influence teachers, lecturers, but also parents, because when you think of imitation and role models, those who are in some form of authority, whether you're a parent, teacher, etc., or church minister, you are in a position of authority and you are a role model. People look at you or look up to you. So you need to be much more intentional how you present yourself, how you live your life, etc., and how you can role model or how you can model the Christian life as best as you can for the sake of others.
Yeah, indeed. It seems to me that a multi-dimensional, rich account of theological education would do well to pay attention to the themes that you're drawing on here. Now, I always like to ask this question, and you're not allowed to say the Bible. So you're stranded on a desert island and you can only take one book, let's say two books with you. What makes the cut?
Well, maybe I'll take my own book with me and start to read it again and reflect on it. Maybe some people would have expected that I would say, well, I would take Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, with me, because that is obviously a very popular one on this topic. But I'm not so sure. I don't think I would take that one. So
more controversy
if I can't say that word, then maybe the Greek New Testament.
That's sneaky. All right, but I'll let you get away with it. Okay, I think we've had enough on the quickfire round here. I'd love to turn to the Apostle Paul. And Paul is in many ways, I mean, obviously, a central focus of your book, and you show that imitation is important in the Pauline epistles. It's multi-directional. It's God and Christ and Paul himself and his co-workers and the divine family. They're all involved in one way, shape, or form. Could you give us a sense of how these layers all work together in Paul's pastoral theology, and maybe just pitch Paul's theology in a nutshell to us? If we had you in a lift at SBL and you say, okay, what is Paul's understanding of imitation? What would you say in a nutshell?
Okay, and the lift will not go to the 50th floor or so.
Yeah, fair enough.
So let me start with the pitch in the lift then. I like that idea. So in the Gospels, especially John, we find the ideas of the disciples imitating Jesus, as simple as that. But in the Pauline writings, Paul inserts himself into this model so that we get a chain of imitation, as it were, with Christ as a supreme model for imitation. Paul imitates Christ, and his converts then imitate Paul. And the chain gets even larger because often Paul is unable to be with the churches he writes to. So he sends trusted co-workers such as Timothy and Titus, or he points his audience to other mature Christians who were accessible to them as concrete examples of imitation. So the expanded chain of imitation becomes then Christ, Paul, surrogates for Paul and Paul's converts. So that was basically the brief pitch. We only reached the second floor, I think. So now a little bit more explanation then. The idea of imitation can be found in all the Pauline letters, but not always to the same extent. So the literal term to imitate occurs in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, and Ephesians, but different mimetic expressions occur in the other Pauline letters. And my findings show that imitation is central to Paul's ethics in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Philippians. It's prominent in Ephesians and more peripheral in the other Pauline letters. And in terms of content, similar to what we find in the Gospels, the content of Paul's call to imitation focuses on humility, self-giving love, and other regard. But Paul does not spell out an exhaustive list of activities of imitation for his audience. And for good reasons. This is how imitation works. And this is again where that concept of discernment or moral reasoning comes in. After carefully observing and studying the lives of Christ, Paul, and other exemplars, Christians must determine what to imitate about them through a creative hermeneutical process. Let me give a small example just to finish this answer from Philippians. In Philippians 2:12, Paul tells the Philippians to work out their own salvation. Very intriguing phrase. And many scholars agree Paul is not referring here to some strange kind of individual works righteousness, because first of all, the you here is plural. So the reference really is to a corporate activity of the Philippian church. But then if you remember that earlier in that chapter, in 2:5, Paul instructed the Philippian church to cultivate moral reasoning. He uses the Greek verb phronein. By examining Christ's paradigmatic example in 2:6-11. So when he then issues the directive that the Philippians should work out their salvation, he is effectively saying that the corporate life of the Philippian church should be patterned on the life of Christ as it is exemplified in the Christ hymn. So let me pause there.
Yeah, there's an awful lot to unpack there. I mean, obviously, people need to get the book. There's too many spoilers otherwise. One of the questions that I think will be raised, certainly is raised in undergraduate lectures when it comes to Paul's language. Look, if I'm going to stand up in a lecture and say, hey, everyone, be imitators of me as I am of Christ, the people in the lecture, especially the people who know me, will think, what a jerk. So some are going to find it difficult that Paul encourages people to imitate him, which is fairly unique as well. Is this a problem? If it isn't, why not?
It may not be a problem, but it is something you need to think of. So one thing we need to remember, that even though Paul urges his audience to imitate him in several letters, the ultimate exemplar remains Christ. Although he doesn't say it often, but in Philippians, as I mentioned, he hints at it. But in 1 Corinthians 11:1, for example, Paul instructs the Corinthians to be imitators of him, just as he is an imitator of Christ. So we must bear that in mind. Now, we must also remember that most of Paul's converts, they came from a pagan background. They did not know Jewish Christian moral values. Now, Paul's letters, they contain plenty of moral instructions. That's not the issue. But I think that Paul prefers to model the Christian life for his converts. And he regularly instructs them to consider him as an exemplar worthy of imitation. Now, I agree, this sounds arrogant. And as you rightly said, I don't think many of us have dared to say publicly, well, if you want to be a better Christian, look at me and imitate me. I mean, people would laugh, they would scoff, etc. And maybe this causes several Pauline scholars, such as Elizabeth Castelli and Adele Reinhardt, they took it in a different direction. They saw Paul's injunction more as power language, where Paul wants to stamp his apostolic authority on his churches. But I think there is another way to look at it, and most scholars seem to agree here, that Paul's injunction to imitate him often occurs in a familial context, in the context of God's family, where Paul considers himself a spiritual parent who wants to lead his children to moral maturity. And Paul uses the injunction to imitate him only in churches that he himself has founded, so in places where he was personally known. And Paul presents himself to his new converts as a concrete example of the Christian moral life, simply as someone who has been a little bit longer on the Christian journey and now encourages his spiritual children to learn from him. So that already sounds quite different. So let me give you an example from 1 Corinthians 4 to see how that works. So in 1 Corinthians 4, in verses 16 and 17, Paul writes, I urge you, to the Corinthians, I urge you then, be imitators of me. That is why I sent to you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ. Now the immediate context here contains rich family language. In verse 14, the Corinthians are called Paul's beloved children. In verse 15, Paul describes himself as the spiritual father of the Corinthians. And in verse 17, Timothy is Paul's beloved and faithful child. So Paul places the concept of imitation in the context of family education, as we know from the Greco-Roman writings. And in his absence, Paul is sending Timothy to help the Corinthian church in imitating him. And Paul's assertion that Timothy will remind them of his ways in Christ Jesus is probably shorthand for his way of life patterned after Christ. Paul would most likely not send Timothy to simply repeat verbally Paul's teaching, but also to exemplify the life he desires for the Corinthians, so that the Corinthians can imitate Paul by observing Timothy. Paul is the spiritual parent of both Timothy and the Corinthians. And Paul presents Timothy here as an exemplary child to help his other children to imitate him. And I think that's a very important dynamic. So, problem, no, if one understands it correctly.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. I mean, I wonder, with a lot of continental philosophy having focused on power dynamics, discourses and power hierarchies, although it can point to a lot of really interesting things, the danger is that if that's your hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And you're right that there is a metaphorical core, or there are root metaphors that are familial in Paul that help us understand this language more deeply.
Chris, just to pick up on this, to some extent I can understand that power language, because when you think of it, imitation does occur a little bit in a hierarchical structure. There is the teacher, the parent who is the role model, where the child or the student. Yeah. So there is a hierarchy, and hence inherently there is some power dynamics. So I think both Jesus and Paul are aware of that. But again, in the foot washing, I didn't mention it, but it's interesting that they are aware of their authoritative status. So in the foot washing, Jesus says, well, if I, your Lord and teacher, do this, you cannot be exempt. So Jesus does acknowledge his authoritative status in the group, but in that position, he becomes a servant. And we see similar with Paul. Paul not denying or undercutting his apostolic authority, but he doesn't use imitation language to emphasize his apostolic authority. He uses his apostolic authority to set humbly an example to follow.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. I'll just dig into Paul finally. Just one more question about Paul, because imitation is ethical, but it's participatory. It's a word that you use throughout. It's cognitive, it's creative, it's hermeneutical, it's transformative. You use a lot of words to describe what's going on here, but maybe you could just in a brief nutshell explain how is Paul's account of imitation, because it's participatory, different from just bland moralism? What role does the Spirit play in all of this?
Yeah. So in my research in other areas, I have done quite a bit of research on the Spirit, so I'm always interested in that topic. And I was a little bit disappointed because when it comes to the role of the Spirit and imitation are not explicitly linked. So I had to work pretty hard, I would say, to make a case for dragging the Spirit into this, as it were, and hopefully in a not in an artificial manner. But I do think that the Spirit facilitates our imitation of Jesus, but in a more indirect manner, in two ways, I think. First, the Spirit is depicted as a moral agent. You find it in John 3, in Romans 8, so both in the Johannine and Pauline writings, which are also strongest on imitation. Where the Spirit is depicted as a moral agent, enabling moral reasoning, which, as we know, is vital in that process of imitation. So that's one way. Second aspect is the Spirit also facilitates interpreting the biblical text. Again, you can go to John 16, etc. And if many examples for imitation are recorded in the text, then again, the Spirit indirectly facilitates imitation. And this means that the most important hermeneutical controls for guiding us in our imitation of Jesus are the biblical text and the Spirit. So even when you think of Jesus is the supreme model for Christian behavior. We need to nuance this. This is true only to the extent that the biblical text indicates it, because certain aspects or actions of Jesus cannot be imitated. We all realize that. So to imitate Jesus appropriately, we must determine the imitation language that the biblical authors use to avoid a subjective pick and mix approach. And the Spirit helps the Christian in the interpretation of the biblical text and in determining what to imitate about Jesus. And as we do so, we will find that the imitation of Jesus, for example, centers on values such as humility, love, forgiveness, unity, self-giving, and other regard. So it's not that we do a kind of a blind attempt of imitating whatever Jesus did. So yeah, the Spirit does play a role, I think, but you have to find it, in a more indirect manner. There's no text that directly says the Spirit will do this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful to think through, Paul. There's an awful lot I'd love to dig into there, and I'm just aware of the time. I mean, we could have spoken about other New Testament writings, and this, I think, just shows the remarkable scope of your work, that you have an entire part dedicated to the Apostolic Fathers, which people need to get this and pick it up. But I wanted to get to the final questions, which I think are important to you, and certainly important to me and many of our listeners. You know, you've written a lot on these matters. Your earlier work on character formation and so on. How did this project deepen, shift, stretch your previous thinking about how virtue and formation work in biblical theology?
Well, imitation, as it relates to human behavior in early Christianity, has a transformative aspect. So someone intentionally seeks out an exemplary person because they see some qualities in that person that they want to acquire too. After all, the idea in antiquity was to imitate an exemplar in order to become a better person. So imitation is directly linked to character formation and to virtue ethics, where the big question is how to live well. So if we Christianize this a little bit, we can ask ourselves, well, how can I live well in both the church and the world? And in my view, imitation has to be part of that answer.
And what would it look like for church leaders, for educators, for lecturers, to take imitation seriously? You know, not just as a theme, one among others, but as a lifestyle, as a method.
Well, I would like to work together with a church leader who maybe who has done some formal theological training, and, for example, design an 8-week curriculum or so on how imitation can be implemented into church leadership as well as discipleship. While most people recognize the reality of imitation in life, I would love to see people being more intentional about making the imitation of Jesus central to their discipleship. For Christians to be more intentional about whom they follow, whether on social media or otherwise, and to be more intentional about what they seek to imitate about others and how this can help them to live out their Christian life better. And I think imitation ethics can greatly help, because imitation ethics is concerned with how abstract moral principles are lived out or embodied in the lives of exemplary people. In Christianity, as we know, Jesus is the supreme example for imitation. So when people become followers of Jesus, they should seek to model their lives on that of Jesus. And the Bible is the main source of information where we can learn how to imitate Jesus. But just as Paul presents himself and others as examples for imitation to his new converts, so Christians who exemplify Jesus in their lives can also function as role models for new Christians. So the ultimate challenge, I think, in this whole exercise is not just to find good role models for your own personal growth, but how we can be good role models for others in their Christian journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one of the things I underlined in the book. Towards the end, you write, ultimately, we must imitate Jesus not for our sake, but for the sake of others. And I thought that was a really important take-home for me. And of course, if people want to get better at sensitive and inappropriate online joking, then they can always follow my Twitter account as well as a form of imitation. Now, let's finish this. What's next for you? Are there areas as well where this conversation about imitation could be expanded? And I'm aware that you do some of this towards the end, where you get into thinking about virtue ethics. But maybe you could take us through.
Yeah, that's always a good question. What's next? Well, having devoted much research to the topic of imitation over the last 12 years and 2 books to show for it, I don't think I want to write more on it, to be honest. Maybe I should start putting it into practice. That would be more helpful. But if my work will be helpful to anyone, that would be fantastic. I also realize that not everyone can afford or is interested in my academic book. So I also wrote a non-technical growth booklet on the topic, which is just 24 pages and costs less than £5. That was the ad. So instead, I like to do 3 things in relation to the topic of imitation. First, I would love to supervise people who want to do doctoral research on the topic with me here at LST and who can advance or even correct my work. That would be fantastic. But secondly, as I mentioned before, I would like to explore how imitation can be integrated into discipleship and leadership courses in churches. But I think I can't do that. I need a church leader to help me develop a particular curriculum. So do contact me if you're interested. And then thirdly, research-wise, I want to go back to that character formation stuff. I want to explore how particularly Aristotle's approach to character formation, in which imitation also features, can shed light on character formation in early Christianity. So still Christian ethics in general.
Yeah, but an awful lot more to do. And by the way, the book that Cor just mentioned, the Grove booklet, can be found. You can find information about that on Cor's academia.edu page. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that once again. Anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on OnScript. This was Chris Tilling talking with Cor Bennema on imitation in early Christianity. Thank you very much for joining us.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.